The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon to everyone present here today. It is my pleasure to welcome you to our webinar, Governance and Risk Mitigation for SMEs, Managing in Times of Uncertainty. This is the fifth in a series of strategic webinars we are holding with young Arab leaders who have been our strategic collaborators since 2018 and for which we are extremely grateful. The Pearl Initiative, for those of you that aren't familiar with us, is the leading and only independent non-profit organisation founded to promote the business case for the implementation of the highest standards of corporate governance, accountability and transparency in the Gulf region's private sector. Launched in 2010, cooperating with the United Nations Office of Partnerships, the Pearl Initiative aims to convene businesses, decision makers and future leaders adopting data-centered corporate governance. The Pearl Initiative also engages the wider business ecosystem in the Gulf region, collaborating with over 40 companies, as well as 30 regional universities to collectively drive our mission forward. We work as a think tank and build data by publishing cutting-edge research reports and case studies to inspire business change. Today's webinar is being held as part of our Governance and SMEs program. As you may be aware, micro, small and medium-sized enterprises are considered the backbone of the regional economy. They account for between 80% and 90% of registered companies across the region, but their contribution to regional GDP does remain low. As SMEs compete with each other in a marketplace and strive to be innovative and sustainable, they must understand the fact that implementing corporate governance is key to facilitating their growth and success. The Pearl Initiative understands the necessity for governance for small businesses, and in 2017, we launched the Corporate Governance in SMEs program to engage small businesses on the importance of corporate governance for positive economic outcomes. Good governance is flexible and can be modified to fit a business's needs and is not solely meant for the realm of multinationals and large corporations. SMEs and practices will help them build a stronger, more resilient business than before. About today's webinar, we are pleased to have this webinar to discuss risk mitigation across the region. During uncertain and challenging times, identifying and preempting the right across the business in near real time is essential and becomes everybody's business. In such times, the way and frequency at which information is reported and aggregated across departments, teams, and functions is paramount. In small businesses, when there is much to be done with a small team, risk management should still remain a top priority. And should be a discipline from day one, even before times become challenging. How can SMEs handle risk management exercises the right way? And how does the business plan play a role in the strategy and disciplined execution required for effective risk mitigation from day one? As I mentioned, we are collaborating with YAL on this session, and I'll just give you a quick introduction to YAL. So YAL, Young Arab Leaders, is also a not-for-profit organization, and they were founded during the World Economic Forum in 2004 under the patronage of His Highness Sheikh Mohammed bin Rashid Al Maktoum, Vice President and Prime Minister of the UAE and Dubai. YAL seeks to leverage the capabilities and expertise of a strong regional network of members in order to personalize the entrepreneurial and professional development of the next generation of leaders. Its mission and vision is to empower the next generation of leaders in the Arab world by developing a strong network of industry and business leaders to serve as mentors and role models to the youth and entrepreneurs across the region. It does so by fostering entrepreneurship and innovation and creating a hub for new business and investment opportunities. YAL has a mentor and advisors network, is engaged in community initiatives such as entrepreneurship workshop series, a mentorship program, and weekend competitions, and has a vast support network. Moving on to our speaker for today, YAL member and the Senior Vice President of Saudi and Bahrain MasterCard. He has over 17 years of banking, strategy consulting, and technology experience, having held a number of roles across multinational banks, top-tier consulting firms, and tech startups. In his previous role at MasterCard, he was the Middle East region lead for MasterCard Advisors, MasterCard's data-driven strategy consulting practice that enables and supports banking, merchant, and government partners around the world. Mr. Khalil, welcome, and thank you for your time and insights for today. As with all of our webinars, I'd like to just point out that we'd like our webinars to be as interactive as possible. We do have a system whereby you can filter your questions through to Mr. Khalil, and he will address those as and when they come through. So in the absence of, a physical actual meeting, handing over.
Thank you very much, Yasmin. I hope you guys can hear me fine. I know that there's been a few challenges with the network today across the country, but I hope that my voice is quite audible. I will try to go slow so that we can all overcome the challenges of the network. So I'll start off with a quick disclaimer. Thanks for having me, first of all, today again. I'm happy to be here, part of the YAL fellowship, and as well as the PERL initiative on corporate governance, and particularly risk management in times of times of uncertainty. So first of all, I'm not a corporate governance expert, not an enterprise risk management expert either. I'm just a business person like many of you around the call. Views are entirely my own and based purely on my own research. My experience is limited, obviously, to having worked for very large institutions, blue chip, Fortune 500 organizations, and as well as obviously mentoring business startups at various stages of their development. In risk, there is no, or in management, there is no one-size-fits-all approach to good corporate governance, neither to risk management, to be fair. Only time will tell whether your devised framework is fit for purpose and whether it ensures the right level of sustainability, and resilience for your business over the long term. Luckily, the internet has survived COVID, so there's plethora of information on the internet that you can find, both on risk governance as well as governance or risk management in general. And I think there's not enough, literature around these two topics. They are evolving topics as we go. Obviously, as our species evolves, new risks will arise naturally, and we will all have to learn how to deal, contain, and manage and cope with them. So with that, I'll quickly just stop on the point of risk, first of all. A lot of times, especially as we were youngsters growing up, we get to learn and understand risks through incidents and accidents. And, the young human mind, the mind of a child basically, doesn't understand risk until they actually start to encounter and live through incidents, and sometimes traumatic. And that's how they start building their resilience toward risk and understanding the concept of risk management. From the first time that they fall when they're crawling, all the way, to having a large car accident in their younger teens or later teens rather, all the way to the first, heartbreaks and so on and so forth. That's how we build our risk management. It's through resilience, through experience, and through empirical knowledge and learnings. But it's very important to really think about it in the right way when we're all grown-up adults, and managing businesses. A lot of times I see entrepreneurs and business people thinking about risk as sort of a last order priority. In reality, if you think about it, when do you buy car insurance? Is it when you buy a car, or is it just before you decide to have an accident? Clearly, nobody decides to have an accident, which means that when you decide to buy a car and people say you got to buy insurance, it helps regulate the relationship amongst management, the board of directors, controlling shareholders, minority shareholders. And enhance in a way to create better efficiencies, improve access to capital, and mitigate and safeguard stakeholders. So in the same way, sort of that we think about corporate governance, we can. Sorry, I don't know if you can see me. It looks like I'm having more challenges here. Yeah, I think we're going to be back in a second. But when we think about the principles of good corporate governance, there's a few, 4 or 5 or 6 principles that everybody should know about to understand what are these pillars. Shareholder recognition. I'm not going to delve into each one of them, just to give you a quick sense. Shareholder recognition is a very important one because it acknowledges and signals to your investors that you recognize each and every one of them regardless of their size, and you respect your investor community. That's basically your ticket to getting more investments in the future. Stakeholder interests. That means you are safeguarding not just the interests of shareholders or you're maximizing shareholder value, but you are working with the broader community of stakeholders, be they internal or external, and be they their clients, your partners, your suppliers, everybody, to acknowledge that you have good practices and processes in place to safeguard the broader community. So, that all obviously in my mind leads to good ethical behavior, which you see on the top right-hand side, and has to have as an enabler business transparency. How you conduct business and how you behave is the ethical part. Now, obviously, there's more rigor around it. The role and responsibilities of boards and of board committees have especially been more important after the Sorbanes-Oxley Act in 2002. I'll touch on that very quickly. But finally, also, the sort of corporate governance has evolved to have risk mitigation, and risk governance is one of the key pillars and principles of good governance, because in a way, good governance is about mitigating risks. And so naturally, risk will be at the center of all of these governance discussions, as we will see going forward. Let's talk now quickly about risk management as a segue to this discussion. When we talk about risk management, think about your businesses at large and what are the sort of spectrums of risks that you are faced with, right? You're normally, as a business, faced with any kind of market risk, operating risk, funding risk, and obviously the idiosyncratic risks, the specific risks to your business that are related to your business model. And you can see some of those on the screen, just to give a few examples. When I talk idiosyncratic risk, that's your business model risk. For instance, if you're an Uber, obviously, a lockdown will force a full shutdown of your Uber operation. Concentration or key person risk. So any business will have concentration risk. You have one large key account and now you're relying on that. What happens if that key account goes away? Funding risks, we're all aware of that. Most importantly, in the life of an MSME, your funding runway. Operating risks, what does that mean in terms of cybersecurity frauds, counterparty risk, logistics disruption, supplier risk, internal controls, process design, maker checker, etc. kind of risks. And obviously the market risks, the ones that are less controllable. Now, obviously some risks are more typical than others in the case of a crisis, or are the typical risks that you see in a crisis. So if we highlight those very quickly, for instance, in the case of a market risk, there's nothing you can do when, for instance, there's a very strong supplier demand shock. As an organization, all you can do is react and self-preserve until that shock sort of passes on or normalizes or stabilizes. Similarly, from an operating perspective, typical of a crisis, you either have a cybersecurity attack, a major fraud attack, which typically will result naturally in either major lawsuits, which brings us to the other part of the spectrum on the legal franchise side of the risks, and not dealing with those and what could mean to the value of your company, could force you into bankruptcy or take you to court, and so on and so forth. So what I'm trying to illustrate here is that some risks will naturally come with crises. Other risks are inherent to your business and are just good things to look at and monitor all the time. The ones that I'm highlighting in these little orange and gray buckets, especially the orange ones, are the external risks that are typical of crises that one should really care about, especially in the context of an enterprise risk management framework. Now, when we let's move from looking at the risks to thinking about how to manage these risks. If you look at the building blocks of a holistic risk management framework, it allows business to derive key benefits, and it relies on a certain number of key building blocks being true and being available for the organization to be able to manage its risk spectrum that it's exposing itself to and its community to. So if you look at this little beehive that we have in front of us here, risk governance obviously is at the top as a general principle. You have to have the risk governance, but you also have to have the other supporting blocks for an enterprise risk management framework to be complete, such as making sure that your risk framework is linked to your strategy, that you have the right measurements in place for your KPIs and for your risks, for risk parameters, obviously. Very good risk communication and reporting, especially in times of crisis like today during COVID. Regulatory issues and compliance. So how do you monitor your regulatory compliance risk, which is a very big risk. It could really lead to you being shut down or paying massive amount of fines. Risk data management, accountabilities and the risk culture, how each one of us within a specific organization as a set of individuals work together to manage risk collectively. And what is the risk appetite framework? What are some of the risks that we're happy to live with, or where are we happy to take incrementally more risk to drive more value for us and for the overall community of stakeholders? And where are we a bit more conservative, right? Banks are more conservative on the risk side when it comes to lending. You don't see that much, for instance, on the operational side of risk. Every organization decides what kind of risk they're comfortable with depending on the implication, the intensity of the risk, and the significance of the impact of that risk. And we'll get to that in a little bit when we talk about tools. Now, when you have a risk framework in place, it doesn't mean that just a bunch of slides and a bunch of Excel tools can be created, and maybe you can implement a couple of IBM and large platform implementations, and you're all set. Really, risk management is everybody's business, and the way that happens is you simply have to have what we call the 3 lines of defense, being kind of like the standard operating risk framework across all businesses, small and large. When you think about risk management, we think about risk management as a mitigation practice, and we think about defense naturally. So let's see how this typically implemented within these organizations or best-in-class organizations actually do that. This is done typically through what we call the 3 lines of defense. The first line of defense is your business unit. Actually, that's the business. That's the business owner. That's everybody who's not a risk person, but is somebody who's doing business. And they are in the business. Eventually, anybody who's doing business, doing any kind of work to grow value or to create value for an organization, they are in the business of taking calculated risk. And each one of you do that. If you think about your day-to-day life, you take calculated risk on an ongoing basis. How much of that calculation is like active in your mind or in the subconscious mind, up to you to decide. But you do take these calculated risks all the time. Should I send this email? Should I respond to this client? Should I wait and not do anything? Should I call my boss? Should I escalate? These are all calculated risks that you take in order to sort of move things forward while minding at the same time the potential implications of doing or not doing something, or deferring it to the future, or delegating it upwards or downwards. The second line of defense, so assuming that the first line of defense is the business unit, where all the risks are really originating, right, and have to be captured. Typically, in good governance organizations, the risks are captured at that level. That's what we call risk discovery or risk transparency, which we're going to talk about in a little bit. When we do that, if we do that properly, this first line of defense, the second line of defense, you'll hear these terms, first, second line, and third line of defense all the time. So it's good to know what they are. Second line of defense, obviously, is monitoring the risk-taking, the appetite, and risk profile. And that's typically in larger organizations. It's a centralized risk function that looks after all the risks at an aggregate level and collectively understands what is the entire risk spectrum that we're dealing with from an organizational perspective, and how much is the organization taking risks, what kind of risks are they, what are the interrelated risks, and how can we mitigate the overall. typically run by risk functions, finance functions. You'll see them in different places, depending on the sector and the organization. Finally, obviously, the third line of defense is regulatory in nature, or it is internal or external audit in nature. And this is typically the checker on the maker, so to speak, right? So, there's plenty of literature on that, so I won't dwell on this. I'll just quickly move on in the interest of time to talking more about governance within and risk management and risk governance really within the firm, right? Now, as I said, I gave a couple of examples about this business manager trying to think about the risk, the calculated risk in their business. Obviously, because every good business manager knows that everything that they're doing entails some kind of risk. So naturally, the risk discussion within a firm is always tense. It's natural, right? It's natural ebb and flow. It's back and forth between the risk side of the business and the business side of the business, right? The organization. And good risk governance really encourages the business and the risk execs to openly align on risk return trade-offs. As we said, risk governance is not an easy fit. Tensions and dynamics that surround them are always very interesting, especially in large organizations. You will see that. When the first line of defense is the business, it's natural that they're also going to be wanting to take on more risk, and there's always going to have to be a sort of a balance being made with the organization to sort of balance that risk return trade-off. So it's this discourse and open dialogue between risk functions and business functions that makes all the difference between successful, resilient organizations and reckless, irresponsible outcomes. Let's take a closer look at the objective of each organization. So if you think about risk organizations, about process control, limiting exposure to risk, less, more about avoidance of loss, of risk, of scandals, etc. More about compliance, being fit with the regulatory requirements even when they're gray, hence more conservative. The business line, it's all about growth, it's all about innovation, it's all about flexibility, agility. You'll hear these terms all almost interchangeably across many of the organizational values that you hear around. The most successful ERM implementations make these discussions not an either or. It can't be it has to be a balance. It can be there can be a winner. It has to be a win-win. It can't be one winner. So it's important to understand that risk spectrum, that risk kind of discourse that happens at the level of very large organizations. Now, the way that large organizations build these frameworks, it's not through implementing a system. Sometimes you hear like an ERM system or what have you. It's really, systems are enablers, but really every ERM ever designed is bespoke, and it's really fit to the purpose of the business and of the sector and of the area of of operation. It could be for the same organization, by the way, it could change from market to market. Now, when you think about risk implementation, and that's something relevant to, we'll simplify it later on in the presentation and discussion. But like large organizations, when they decide to build a risk framework, they first think about risk transparency. So how are we creating transparency, capturing risks? What is the universe of the risks that we are facing and exposing ourselves to internally and externally? And what are data sources to support that? And how do you establish understanding at business line level, right? Clearly articulating what are the trade-offs that you're willing to take from a risk return spectrum perspective. Secondly, I think this is where an organization typically comes together, and this is a very iterative process, by the way. It doesn't happen one time. It's an iteration after iteration that really polishes the risk and ERM framework with an organization. So clearly defining your aspiration as an organization in terms of what you're trying to do from business and risk agenda perspective are very important. Then agreeing on the key elements and the boundaries of that risk framework. What are the things we are more comfortable with, as I said, less comfortable with? What is our risk appetite like? What is our risk acceptance criteria, basically? And that has to be approved by the board, because that is a reflection of the investor sentiment about the level of risk appetite that an organization should take, whether it's a bank or a transit organization or a mobility organization or a supermarket. It doesn't matter. Finally, that's when you actually can start implementing a holistic ERM implementation, and that's how typically organizations do it. Now you understand why some of them have to use technology, very advanced technology platforms to do so, because risks are very real, for the organization to get to grips with what are the real so to speak, risks that the organization is faced with at an aggregate level. That's again at the large level, large organization level. These frameworks apply to. And finally, when you think about this spectrum, i.e., how deep a risk framework can be, and to you start, to the startup owners or startup entrepreneurs or MSME owners or business managers, this is a framework that you can look at to think through how developed, right, your organization is. And as you grow, you will actually have to climb up that risk spectrum and be more evolved in your risk journey. So at the very basic level, like I said, even at an MSME level, even if you have a small, lemonade stand, you need to understand what your risk is, and you have to write down all these risks. That's called risk transparency. That's the building block you see on the bottom left of the picture. Risk transparency is about saying, okay, I have a lemonade stand, so that means the things that can go bad is I can have no demand, I can run out of lemons, my sugar can be eaten by a rat, and so on and so forth. But you have to outline all these risks up front, as many as you can. And it's a totally
Unmuted.
largest bankruptcy, in U.S. history to 2002. But obviously that is the kind of, and there's other, examples you can look up, even some as recent as 1MDB in Malaysia. And obviously the reason I'm highlighting all of these is because, as you think through, what the implications of that is, obviously there was a massive reaction from regulators in the US. That's how Sarbanes-Oxley Act was enacted in 2002, which at a high level, really clamped down on creative accounting practices by closing loopholes, strengthening corporate governance rules, increasing accountability and disclosure, requirements for corporate transparency, strengthening whistleblower protections, penalties for corporate executives, especially on, from a malpractice perspective, and so on and so forth. So that is a direct result of these two very large, bankruptcies, Chapter 11 filings in 2002 and 2003, or 1 and 2 rather, which were not, which were the largest in history to 2008 when obviously Lehman Brothers happened. So as I talk to you through this history a little bit also, I think it's also interesting to point out that if you look at all these interesting startups that we have on the screen, risk governance is obviously, as I said, it is an evolving science, and in a way it will continue to evolve, especially in the rise of these super apps, the platform, as we call them. I like this quote: "You either will become a platform, or you'll be devoured or killed by it." So if you think about these companies, what do they all have in common? Like these tech stocks you should all invest in, but they all had at some point run-ins with regulators around antitrust, around internal control issues, other regulatory concerns, and so on and so forth. So I think it'll be an interesting question for another day. I'm not saying it's for today. I'm not going to get into it. I think the new, where innovation at breakneck speed is the new creative accounting of the WorldCom and Enrons of the world, right? Back in the day, in 2001, 2002, you were very creative on the accounting side. You got away with it for a few quarters, and then you filed for bankruptcy and people go to jail. What is the equivalent of that in a different environment where it's not about creative accounting? Although maybe some would argue that in the case of, for instance, like WeWork, I think there's massive creative accounting at play. Again, discussion to be had for another day. But I think it's very interesting to see how corporate governance will and has to eventually evolve to be able to adapt to this new phenomenon of the platforms. Now let's talk and let's zone in a little quickly, be a bit more focused on MSMEs and startups, and look at when they actually fail and why they fail. The question is that you guys are obviously asking, and that's why you're here, is during uncertain and challenging times, how do you identify and preempt risks that are arising across the business in near real time, if possible, and how do you make it everybody's business? So let's have a quick look at that. I'm sure some of you have seen this picture on the left-hand side, and hopefully on the right-hand side as well, if you're a movie buff like myself. And a question I'd like to ask all of us is, like, when you think about survivorship bias in the context of entrepreneurs and startups, and I'm sure many of you have heard of this before, it is simply a way for you to think about risk and to think about how not to analyze risks, actually, and get to a level or a stage where you're confusing correlation with causation. This is very important. In the context of MSMEs, this is a typical concept you hear about in entrepreneurship, which describes our tendency, right? Survivorship bias describes our tendency to focus on the people or things that have passed some kind of selection process, whether it is literal survival in the gladiator pits, like in the case of Russell Crowe, or coming back from an air combat battle, right? And forgetting about other important factors while you are considering the fact, like, oh, Russell Crowe is so amazing, he's a great gladiator. That means a lot of gladiators survived the pit. That's not true. Or saying, oh, so many pilots have done really well in air combat. Second World War must have been really easy, and so many of them must have survived. That's not true. Okay, this is called survivorship bias, which is very strongly related to sample bias. How you are looking at the data and what data you are excluding, that is tarnishing your analysis and skewing your perspective or your findings. Now, if you look at that plane I showed you earlier, it had a bunch of holes on it. And let me just go back quickly to the previous slide and tell you the story. So this is a typical example of, you might be familiar with the story from World War II planes. So what happened in World War II, planes would go out to air combat, and when they come back, they would have a lot of bullets in them. So the engineers came up with a great idea to just strengthen the metal on the planes. And what they did is they put together all the data of all the planes that came back from battle, and they started, looking at the data where the bullets came. And so they decided, okay, you know what? It's both of the wings that have to be, strengthened, and maybe the core body of the plane, because that could be bad for the engines. Now, that makes sense, because if you look at the data, it's plotted around these areas. It's around the wings, and it's around the tail, and so on and so forth. But what the engineers realized quickly that they were really missing was what a guy called Abraham Wald pointed out. He was a very intelligent, obviously, statistician. He was into statistics, and he came with a glaring and very insightful observation. The guy said, look, you'll be making a terrible mistake by upgrading the armor along these hard-hit parts of the plane because you have that data. Because simply, the planes that are coming back from battles are the ones that survive. The ones actually that don't survive are the ones you should be looking at. And if you do, you'll notice actually it's the areas that don't have bullet holes that don't come back from battle. It's the engines, obviously, and the rudders. And that is a problem, because if these are hit, as a pilot, you can't fly the plane or you can't steer the plane, so you'll inevitably crash. And so basically, his point was, this is where you need to strengthen your planes. Now, why is this important in the life of an entrepreneur? And it's interesting that we're bringing this example, by the way, from the airspace industry, because, the airspace industry is the poster child of safety, given the severity of the risks it exposes to us when we fly a plane. We can crash and die very simply. They have come up with a very rigorous process as an industry to ensure that the same error is mitigated globally. So that the errors are disseminated in real time to all the airlines so that they are captured as per the standards into the BAU operating process, and all the cracks are future-proofed for good. This is a very good example, the airline industry, of how to manage risk. Now, obviously, you guys are in the risk. You're in the business of taking risks because you're entrepreneurs and you're SMEs. You're very courageous people, and I really admire you. But you also want to take risks and you want to succeed. And I'm sure you've read a lot about, how to become the next Mark Zuckerberg or Jack Dorsey or whatever. And I think that's great. But don't forget, these are the 0.0001% of successful occurrences. What you have to look at is where people fail and what makes for a failure in the life of a startup or an MSME. And frankly, there's not a lot of support around that, I know, because typically when you even look at this Google example I have on the screen, even when you Google people who failed in business, you'll get all the wrong examples. These are people that have actually succeeded. I mean, Oprah, Walt Disney, Thomas Edison, Albert Einstein. I don't know why I'm in there. I see my name, JK, although I think it's JK Rowling. Abraham Lincoln, these are all successful people. So that are faced, that MSMEs and startups are faced with, and why do they fail? And if you look at that science, this is what you get. The above, or what you see here on the slide, are 14 of the most frequently cited risks for why startups fail. But while some are structural risks, such as like market product fit or weak leadership, as you can see on the slide, or cash burn rate, others are totally mitigatable risks. These are risks that you can mitigate in your mitigation plan. That should be part of your business plan. And these should be the kind of risks that are identified at the level of line of business or product of 2 risks that you will address as you ramp up in order to ensure that your business is more sustainable and resilient to external shocks. There's absolutely no rule that says your business plan should only focus on business and revenue and growth. I think it is very mature when I see a business plan that has risks, even if it's a 2-3 liner that says, you know, as part of our business plan, we've identified these 2 or 3 risks that we think are material risks that we will be addressing from day 1, period. This is what we're going to be doing, like an action plan. I think that shows maturity, and it shows how entrepreneurs are really educating risk in their culture, really, their startup culture. Now let's really take a look at how this can be brought to see more risks, right? Because we are increasingly living in a fast-paced, changing world, more risk, more interconnected risk, more contagion risk, right? So black swans are more frequent and they're getting more violent. So nobody tells me, oh, today, you know, this is the end of the world because there's so many, you know, too many crises happening. I think it's just a nature. We've never been a species of 7 billion people. We've never had that much connectivity, that much travel, you know, ability to move around. It's important, I think, to be able to look at things in a simplified manner. But, you know, the first thing about the risk, I would say, is really start thinking about risk. And let me share with you some best practice principles and key design principles, you know, that, and I'm seeing that some of your questions are starting to pop up. That's a good thing. Please keep the questions coming and we'll talk about them at the end. And I'm happy to go back to any slide that you guys want me to talk to. But let's talk about some best practice principles when it comes to a risk. So you have to have strong and visible commitment from the board or the top leadership. It doesn't matter, right? But you have to be committed as an organization to want to control, understand, first of all, you know, articulate, capture, and mitigate risk. That's the first thing. Then you have to define your risk appetite, as we said. Then you have to ratify that practice across all lines of business and create that first line of defense. Everybody in the organization has to be able to articulate and relay back to the center what are all the risks that they believe the business is being exposed to on a continuous basis. Once that happens, then there could be a healthy discussion. This is point number 4, 5, and 6. We can have a healthy discussion about where these risks are coming from, how they affect us internally and externally, and what do we have to do about them? What are the accountabilities internally, and what kind of separation of duties we have to put in place, whether it's an escalation or authority matrix, no matter, maker checker processes, different tools for you to break down risks into smaller, more contained risks and really deal with it at the very root cause. And obviously, at the same time, there has to be a centralized ledger, right, a repository of all these risks, so that the organization is able to quantify the end-to-end risk that it is taking by, interacting with the market at large. From a design principle perspective, key questions you have to ask yourself, obviously, are, what risk and control process should be centralized or distributed? What is the overall risk governance structure? What should our approval authority matrix be? I mentioned some of these already. How are you capturing them? What are the tools that you're using? How to identify risk? And how agile is the business to really pivot and be able to maybe, in an agile manner, react to risk, whether it's internal or external? And how, most importantly, are we balancing short versus long-term growth from a sustainability perspective for the organization and for the business concern? I think these are some of the key questions you need to think about as you develop your own risk approach and your own risk framework. And as I said, these constitute the elements of one single framework, but there's no one solution. You have to come up with your own solution. So let's go back to that discussion we were having about the risks of why organizations, small business concerns, small startups and MSMEs, they fail. I've highlighted and read the ones in red, if you look at them, I'm going to call them risks to focus or risks to focus on mitigating, because these are risks you can actively mitigate even from day one or day two, right? Poor prototyping process early on, customer feedback, low barriers to entry, slow market, slow time to market, operational risks, slow reaction to market risks, cash burn, inability to raise funds, poor marketing or high cost of customer acquisition cost. These are all very important risks, and these are risks that you can really mitigate from day one. And I'll show you how in a few seconds. Let me just quickly show you a couple of examples of how entrepreneurs have actually dealt with that. So I like this example from this is a sanitized example of an email I got from one of our portfolio companies that I invest in as an angel investor. And without going into the details, I'll just show you like 2 or 3 examples of how really risk starts from day one without even a tool. But you can tell that from the entrepreneur's perspective, there is a risk culture. The risk mindset at play, and that immediately gives you as an investor comfort that there is real maturity and that there's leadership he's facing and where he needs to really focus his energy and support with his team. So look at the example, sorry, that I've highlighted in orange. He says burn rate is something that is a concern to them, right? With the right disclosures obviously around it. They're not going to share their financial concerns with all the investors. And it's immediately tackled. He immediately tackles the impact of COVID, in this case, in a positive way on his business, right? Next, he shares the concerns. Look at this other example at the bottom of the page. Concerns around his customer acquisition cost, and frankly proposes it's something him and his team are really continuously working on, and realizes a concern. Very good transparency, able to articulate the risk. Invites me as an investor to come to help if I have any ideas for him as well. Finally, notices he has a lessons learned section, which I really like. It shows like openness to take risks, fail, and learn and correct. 2 points that he covers really quickly from the 4 lessons learned that are actually risk related. He highlights some of the key issues that COVID has exposed in the existing business model, and he highlights very honestly, we're working to make sure that we don't waste this moment and we learn from it. And then the second risk at the bottom, he finally highlights potential changes in customer preferences as a risk that they have also identified and they are working on. And again, shows maturity, courage, and ability to understand the risk, but also accept it and contain it and want to work to solve it, right? That's a really good example of how the startup is engaging and communicating with their board and investors on a quarterly basis. And you can see the benefits. Startup is able to show his board the factor that he's a conscientious person and he's conscientiously about he knows what he wants to do with his business. He cares about how it's evolving. His interests are aligned to my interests. He doesn't want to waste the investors' money, and he wants to do good, and he wants to lead this organization in a very positive way. This is just a simple example of how you can communicate as well with your investors and give them the comfort that you're on top of things. Now, let me show you in the last section just a couple of examples of what good practice frameworks look like and some key pointers to keep in mind when you think about risk. At a medium to small size or small to medium size enterprise level, the key building blocks of good governance and risk governance specifically, I would say, are how are you governing your organization to ensure proper alignment between investors and management. So that's governance. People, do they have a resilient organization? Do they understand their role as the first and second line of defense? Do you have the right efficient operating framework in place? Do you have the right processes in place? Are you monitoring the risks? Do you have the right tools to do that? Do you have the right cadence or frequency to do that? How resilient is the risk management framework? I mean, obviously, as I said, as the organization grows, your risk management framework has to evolve. So keep that in mind. And what is the continuous communication that you are, implementing is in order to continuously communicate, like I said, like I showed in one of the previous examples, whether it's with your investor community, with your board, also with your staff, when highlighting like new learnings from failures within the organization has to share these risks, share these learnings so that they diminish these risks going forward and create awareness around the organization. Also, communication with the external community is extremely important, especially in times of crisis, something to keep in mind. This is, by the way, for those of you who are still wondering, like, where do I start? I get this a lot, like, okay, I don't know what to do. This is a good place to start. As I said, at the very core of the risk spectrum, of the risk maturity spectrum, there's risk transparency. Risk transparency means, how do I start to, with a simple tool, understand what are the key concerns that I have to worry about? Very simple. Grab a piece of paper, sheet of paper, and write down on a 2x2 on a little table what are the most likely risks that are likely to happen, and what is the impact of these risks. Like let me take the lemonade stand example again. In the lemonade example stand, you are looking at, for instance, lemon shortage as one risk. Now, is it a very likely risk to happen? Lemon shortage? I don't think so. There's plenty of lemons in the market. However, if it happens, does it have a high impact? Heck yeah. So that's a high impact, low likelihood of occurrence. But it's something that you have to make sure that you are on top of, because the impact is super high. You cannot live with that risk. That's a severe risk. If it happens, you have simply no lemonade left. You can take another risk, for instance. Again, lemonade stand. Risk of, a car crashing into a lemonade stand. Likelihood, I would say medium. Yeah, we have seen a lot of cars crash into a lot of things. But if that happens, is there an impact to your lemonade stand? Probably not the stand itself, but maybe the people working behind it. So that is a high, impact, again, incident. Medium occurrence, high impact. So what do you do about it? Maybe insurance is a good idea, right? So that's why you have to understand the various risks by just writing it down, fleshing out the list, and looking at it from every perspective. Like I said, different kind of risks: operational, market, idiosyncratic, funding related, etc., and so on and so forth by category, and run this exercise. What is the likelihood? High, medium, low. What is the severity? Is it going to be something that's going to stop my business from running, or is it going to be something like low, like, oh, it's too sunny today, so heat is a problem, but we can survive. You just buy an umbrella or fan or whatever. So think about these things. I'm going to try to leave some time for questions, but as I do so, just want to quickly run through the last slide that I prepared to give you an example of how you can mitigate your risk, and we just touched on a couple of them. So like I said, think about your key person risk. Key person risk means, do you have a person in your organization that if they leave, they're going to pose a significant risk to the sustainability of your organization? What are you doing about it? How are you breaking down that risk into maybe, syndication of the responsibilities, or breaking down these responsibilities into multiple roles, or creating backups for these people? Another one, maybe if you look down the line, down the table, cash burn and rate and runway. Do you have a clear funding plan? And if not, how are we going to continue to sustain your organization without that kind of funding? Another cybersecurity one is cybersecurity risk, is a very important one for me, especially in today's day and age. This is a risk everybody's exposed to, because almost every business is an online business. So how are you managing to create a right, safe environment, right, for your digital business, but also for the stakeholders partaking in your business, whether they are suppliers, whether they are customers, and so on and so forth. How do you create that kind of level of secure environment for all the stakeholders involved and at play with? Finally, I'll share with you a quick, I would say framework for managing risks in uncertain times that I came up with. So it's a personal framework that I call C.O.P.E. And you'll see it has 4 pillars, obviously, C.O.P.E. The first thing I would say is when we were faced with COVID is to understand, how to manage the situation in the sense of, how do you manage to contain and control, at first strike, when the incident happens, whether it's COVID or something else, there's a lockdown, there's a fire, there's a severe incident of some sort. First of all, the first thing you have to do is react to quickly control the situation. So this is an emotionless time where you have to be pretty much avoid of emotions, focus on controlling the situation. Be there, increase cadence, whether you have to communicate with your staff or with the external stakeholders, create business proximity. In the case of COVID, for instance, especially in a time of social distancing, you have to create business proximity. Make people feel like you're in control, you're taking care of the situation. Second step, own it. Keep your behaviors at bay. You, as the leader of an organization, you have to own the situation. You have to create a safe environment for people to come and open up and share their concerns. For partners, same thing, to come up and share their concerns, their difficulties, where things are not going well for them, where they need your help. Third step, once you've controlled the situation, owned the situation, and really taken a leadership stance vis-a-vis what's going on, the third step is now, now that you've taken care of yourself, your team, you've oxygenated, you've taken a step back, partner. Go out there, think what are your priorities that you can do to safeguard your business and safeguard your partner's business. Having now created virtual visibility and business proximity, now is the time to start creating some actions and some impact, some positive impact to mitigate, be it by communicating more, being by identifying key pain points of your clients or suppliers and deciding how you can help them based on your capabilities to come up with inventive or creative solutions around these challenges. And finally, as our entrepreneur said in his email, do not lose this moment. Do not waste this moment, right? It's very important to think holistically of what's happening. So think through the learnings from every incident and build future-proof solutions. Enhance your business. Identify all the cracks and the potential weaknesses that have allowed you or have unfortunately exposed you to the risk. And allow yourself to come up with the right guardrails so in the future, you don't have to be as exposed or exposed at all potentially to these risks, whether they are supply chain risks, business continuity risks, what have you. In the case of COVID, obviously, if you're a digital business that is selling product online and suddenly there's a lockdown and you have nobody to deliver, or you're relying on one partner, that partner cannot deliver, what do you do to allow that partner to continue to operate? So I think these are some of the ideas that I'm going to leave you with before I turn to questions. And hopefully I've already answered many of the questions, but if there are any, I'm happy to take any questions now. So please feel free to shoot. One question I'm getting obviously is, will this be a recorded version of the presentation be available after the webinar? I imagine that it is. I encourage you to reach out to the organizers themselves to share that with you. I don't think I don't think it's going to be a problem. Another question I'm getting is, again, I don't know where to start. This is very confusing. What is the first thing? I think it's a good question. The first thing I would say to start is this simple framework, right? As I said, write down across all the categories of risk, what are some of the highest severity risks, and what is the likelihood of occurrence of these risks, and then you can start really to understand the spectrum that you're operating with at your own business function, and ask every business function, that's the first line of defense, to document this wide of risks that you are exposed to as an organization. That's when you can start putting your business, or start safeguarding your business and start putting your mitigation plan in place. Another question I get a lot is, I'm a one-man show. I'm running this business by myself. It's just a very small startup where I'm just getting started. Where do I start? It's no different. You have to go back to this very simple risk discovery and risk transparency tool. It allows you to, even if you do this exercise, by the way, once or twice a year, it's more than enough for you to really get a grip and really understand the spectrum of the risk that you are exposing yourself to and exposing other stakeholders in the community that you're operating into, and start thinking about the key mitigation actions that you have to put in place to be able to contain this risk. Any other questions? What do investors look when looking at our startup risk culture? Good question. So investors look, I think the first thing investors want to see is a level of maturity in risk governance. So they want to understand, and please keep your questions coming. I mean, I think we'll go for another 3-4 minutes and then we'll call it quits. But I think this is a very important question. Investors will always look at the risk even without you looking at it. So even when you're not looking at risks yourself, investors are assessing it against a risk spectrum, trying to understand what are actually all the risks that you as a business will expose their portfolio to. So if you do that work for them and you come prepared and you say, okay, these are all the market risks, these are all the operational risks, these are all the other risks. And if you do that very clearly, I think you would be giving a great head start for investors, and it will show them also that you are a responsible, conscientious entrepreneur who cares about their money and who's not going to spend it or waste it, and who knows what they're doing. So it's very important to show risk maturity. Now, obviously, don't go scare your investors, right? But you also scare your investors if you don't show them anything. So don't show too many risks that are way too scary. That will make them think, wow, this guy only thinks about risk, or this lady only thinks about risk. I don't know if they can run a business, because it takes a certain kind of person to go out and face these risks, right? So you just have to show the most important or critical or most severe risks, and the rest of them, you can really park them, because at least that shows some level of risk governance maturity to your investors, and they'll be happy with that. I'll pause for another 20 seconds, see if there's any more questions. Otherwise, I think we can wrap it up for today. I think I've taken more than 60 minutes, but it's been a great conversation. I hope you guys enjoyed it. And if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me. I'm available on LinkedIn or any other medium through the Young Guy of Leaders Network. They can also share with you a way to find me or connect with me. And I'm happy to take more of your questions offline. Great. Excellent. Thank you so much. Thank you for having me, and it's been a great opportunity to talk to you about this interesting topic, especially in this time. Please stay home, stay safe, and until we meet again. Thank you very much. Have a good one.